Hi, I'm Vanessa, and this is my research project. So, for my project, I decided to research the topic of the relationship between PBIS and students' intrinsic motivation in elementary schools. I chose this topic because my school utilizes a PBIS reward system where every student gets rewarded for just about everything they do at school. And I feel like it's just gone a little bit too far in using the rewards as a motivator and therefore has kind of ruined their intrinsic motivation. I find a lot of students coming to me saying, "Hey, if I do this, what do I get? Or if I do this, can I get a B ticket?" So I just noticed they're really lacking in that intrinsic motivation. And this also related to what we learned in this course. One of our readings mentioned that employers are noticing this being a problem where their workers constantly want praise or reward for the work that they're doing. So, my research question was, how does the use of PBIS affect students' motivation to behave appropriately without external rewards? The research study that I found, their scope of their study was that an emphasis on the frequent use of teacher centered praise, rewards, and punitive consequences promotes students' extrinsic motivation, but stifles their intrinsic motivation for pro social behavior. So, in the research study, they examined 10,000 students. They gave them a 24-question survey with questions relating to their motivation and willingness to help others and to follow the rules. So, those were their two domains. And another important thing to note was that the schools that they chose were schools that utilized a PBIS reward system school wide, as well as having ESL programs and also having a zero tolerance policy for behavior. There were two theories that were explained in the research article. So, the first one is the moral development theory, which says that students consider how others think and feel. And then the other one was the self determination theory, which just means that they choose to do things because they truly care and not for the reward. So, the findings of the research study, the first one was that tangible rewards do have their pros, but they also do have their cons. So, obviously, tangible rewards can be used to motivate students, but they were also found that they can also be used to control students, which obviously you want to avoid in any way. So, that would be the con behind it. Another good thing was that praising students did relate or result in a more positive teacher student relationship. So, because you are praising them more often, you're having more frequent conversations with them, and your conversations are more positive. So, therefore, you're having a more positive relationship with your students. They also found that the use of rewards and praise resulted in slightly higher intrinsic motivation and actually not less. But it did note that that was in the short term use of the reward system. So that would basically be their result. And then, like I mentioned in the previous slide, they kind of had this like perfect trifecta, is what I called it. So, not only did they have the PBIS reward system with praise and rewards, but they also had two other things working with the system. One being the zero tolerance policy. So, even though they're rewarding the positive behavior, if there are negative behaviors that you want to try to avoid, and obviously the more extreme ones, they do have a zero tolerance policy with their behavior and they do strictly enforce consequences. And then the other one would be the SEL lessons. So, just teaching and showing kids how to behave and kind of trying to avoid the negative behaviors in doing so. So, those three things kind of worked like hand in hand in the schools that they studied. And then the last finding that they had was that you can't really strengthen someone's natural internal motivation unless they feel like they have control and ownership over what they are doing. So, kind of going back to those two theories, students develop this over time. So, that's why it's important to reward them, but then to kind of pull back on that rewarding system. That way, they are more motivated internally. So, in conclusion, it was found that in schools implementing the PBIS reward system, students were more likely to behave for external reasons. However, over time, it was associated with a stronger internal motivation to do the right thing. So, mostly in like the younger age children, they did want to receive the rewards, but then over time, they grew to have a better internal motivation. It does suggest that although PBIS does not appear to negatively affect intrinsic motivation, that teachers should be cautious about relying too heavily on praise and rewards as their primary method for encouraging behavior. So, kind of like I said previously, you want to start to pull back on that and make sure that students are building that intrinsic motivation over time. So, my next steps would be to just work towards having a more balanced motivation system. Like I said, we already use PBIS. So, just using some of the frameworks learned in that research study, as well as researching some SEL activities to help with behavior and to avoid those negative behaviors if at all possible. And then just researching what helps to build that intrinsic motivation when it comes to behavior. And here are my references. Thanks for watching.